Hello gardener, and welcome to my March garden guide, which gives you ideas on things to either start from seed or transplant right now, along with expert tips and garden task reminders to help keep you on track. I do a garden guide every single month, so if you enjoy this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel so you don't miss a single one. You can find my monthly garden guides in my monthly garden guides playlist, or join my email group and I will send you the guide automatically at the beginning of every single month. I will link all of these things in the description below. If you're new here, hello and welcome. My name is Jara and I teach people how to garden and grow food. So you have come to the right place if you want to improve your gardening skills. All right, let's get started with this guide. The official date of spring this year is March 19th, and there is so much that can be planted right now, whether you have passed your last spring frost date or not. Therefore, as I review each crop category, I will say, if you passed your last spring frost date, then do this. Or if you have not passed your last spring frost date, then do this. I'm just trying to be a little bit more accurate for everybody. If you do not know your last spring frost date, then please visit this website right here. You enter in your zip code and it will give you an estimated date. This date is very important to know because you will backtrack from here to figure out when to sow seeds or figure out when you need to start planting outside. All right, so let's talk about all the things that can be started from seed or transplanted this month. I'm going to go through each crop, but just know that I probably have a dedicated growing guide specific to that crop that will give you step-by-step directions on how to grow it from seed. So if one exists, I'll just link all of that below in the description. And don't forget to check out my website if you want to find seeds or plants for anything that I mention in my videos. Our first category of crops is corn. If you're past your last spring frost date like me, you can begin direct sowing seeds for corn. All sorts of corn, sweet corn, dent, popcorn, or flint corn. I have issues getting good germination when I direct sow corn seeds, so I start them indoors in these 72 cell seed trays. I put this over a heat mat, and then I put this inside of a mini greenhouse so it's nice and warm, which really helps get good germination. As you can see, I got near perfect germination. Once these seedlings are 3 weeks old, I will transplant them into the garden. If you're not past your last spring frost date, you can sow corn seeds just like this 3 weeks before your last spring frost date to get a head start on the season. I just plant one seed per cell. This is especially advantageous if you have a short, warm season to grow corn. This technique is not so practical if you're growing fields of corn. In that case, it's more efficient to just direct sow the seeds. But for small backyard home gardeners with a few smaller beds of corn, this technique really works out great. And this leads me into my second crop to start growing this month, squash. If you are past your last spring frost date, you can direct sow seeds for squash. While my corn seedlings start growing, I'm going to start direct sowing seeds for a large vining type of squash like Seminole pumpkin, so it can grow under the corn and sprawl out to block out the weeds and maximize my growing space. If you struggle with squash bugs or the dreaded squash vine borer, I highly recommend you choose squash cultivars in one of these two groups. These types of squash cultivars have extra thick and woody stems that make it hard for the bugs to get into them. They also have a higher disease tolerance than most. I'm not saying you won't get any pests or diseases, it's just that these are tough plants that will tolerate more disease and pest pressure before dying. This increases your chances of harvesting something. If you struggle to grow zucchini because zucchini is in the Cucurbita pepo family and they are not as strong, then I recommend growing a zucchini alternative like Tromboncino rapicante, which is in the C. moscata family. It tastes better than zucchini in my opinion. Or you can try growing this Mayan squash called Calabacita chica, which is a very rare and hard to find squash cultivar, but I do have seeds on my website. It is part of the C. pepo family, but it is native to South America and is super disease tolerant. This plant has been growing here since last September and is like unfazed by anything so far, which says a lot for my Florida garden. It produces these small squashes that kind of look like Seminole pumpkins when fully mature, but you harvest the squash when they are small and immature, still green with some white streaks on the outside of them, to use it basically just like you would zucchini. They are commonly stuffed and baked in Mexico. If you're not past your last spring frost date, you can get a head start by sowing seeds in 4-inch size pots or solo cups indoors about 6 weeks before your last spring frost date. All right, so moving along, we have beans and cowpeas. This is such an easy crop, especially if you're a beginner gardener. There are bush beans and then there are pole beans. Bush beans are great because they are small plants, getting no more than about 1.5 foot tall or so they can easily be planted underneath larger crops like corn or tomatoes. Pole beans are more productive than bush beans in my experience, and they require a vertical trellis to grow on. I do have a preference for pole beans because I don't don't have to bend over to harvest out all the beans like I do with the bush type. If you're past your last spring frost date, like me, you can start direct sowing seeds for beans. If I had to choose just one bean to grow, it would be the rattlesnake pole bean, because they tolerate a wide range of conditions and always produce very well for me. They are pretty too. The pods are green and it has like these purple streaks on them. For dried shelling beans, I cannot recommend Puerto Rican black beans enough, and for cowpeas, I really like pink eye purple hull peas. I also recommend Thai soldier long beans. They're kind of like a mix between a green bean and a yard long bean. They are super productive with long pods that can be eaten in its entirety like green beans. I have a video all about harvesting them, which I will link below. All of these cultivars are extremely vigorous, take on the heat like a champ, and are very delicious. If you're not past your last spring frost date, you can sow one seed for a bean or cowpea type of plant in these 72 cell seed trays, just like what I did with the corn here. A lot of people think you can't sow seeds like this for corn or beans because they get transplant shock, which is true. They really don't like their root systems to be messed with. But when you sow them in these little 72 cell seed trays, you basically grow out a little plug. And when you pop them out, it conserves the entire root system. They don't get disturbed at all. So then I just plant them right into the ground and they pick right back up and start growing. But the number one thing I would say, if you're going to do this with corn or beans, is you have to pop these out and plant them in the garden when they are 3 weeks old. Anything beyond that, I find that the roots get really root bound, the plants start getting yellow, and it does affect their growth, especially for corn, because some corn plants can get like 8 foot tall. And I notice if they get root bound when I'm doing this, if I don't pay attention and plant them on time, they do get a little bit stunted in growth. So we don't want that. Just make sure you time out everything properly. You plant these out at the 3-week mark, so make sure you have your garden area ready. Okay, so moving into the next crop, greens, all sorts of greens. Let me break this one down for you. If you're in garden zones 8 and 9, you still have time to direct sow seeds for cool season greens like these right here. However, if you're in zone 10 and 11, don't waste your time. Except for tatsoi and mustard greens, you can keep sowing seeds for those. You should have planted your last rounds of cool weather or spring crops in January and February so that you can finish up harvesting them in March. Your focus now in March should be planting summer crops because the heat returns by the end of this month. At least for me it does. Zones 10 and 11 barely have a spring. It just goes from cool to hot. Instead, start planting alternative heat-loving greens like these right here. These are the greens that will carry you through summer. If you have any favorite heat-tolerant greens that I missed, please comment below because I know there are a lot of them. Some other greens include mustard greens, kale, and Napa cabbage. At this point, I only recommend zones 8 and 9 to transplant these right now. It's getting just way too hot for zones 10 and 11 to get started planting them right now. I recommend that all hot climate gardeners plant these things in a spot that gets full morning sun with afternoon shade. This will help them last much longer into the summer. My absolute favorite type of kale is the lacinato types like Black Tuscan, Dazzling Blue, and Black Magic because they handle the heat very well. I have had plants survive over 2 years in my garden if grown in a spot that gets afternoon shade. Next up, we have herbs. It is okay to either transplant or direct sow seeds for all sorts of herbs if you're past your last spring frost date. Here are some ideas of herbs that I love to grow. Many of these are host plants for various butterflies and attract loads of beneficials to your garden. And since the heat is returning very soon for zones 10 and 11, I recommend you plant a lot of tropical herbs like these right here. Some of these can be started from seed while others are grown from cuttings or root pieces like ginger grown from rhizomes. These tropical herbs will carry you through the summer when all the traditional European herbs start to die off from just too much heat and rain. If you're not past your last spring frost date, then start sowing herb seeds indoors 6 to 8 weeks before your last spring frost date. I really love to sow rows and rows of herbs in the same 72 cell seed trays that I use with corn and beans so I can grow a lot of them at once. Or if you have existing plants in your garden, you can start taking cuttings and propagate them. These are some thyme, oregano, rosemary, mint, and basil cuttings that I took. I removed the lower leaves and dipped them into some rooting hormone powder. They quickly took root and are ready to be transplanted outside. This is much faster than starting all the way from seed. It is too late to just get started sowing seeds for bulbing onions for zones 8 through 11. That's it. The window to plant onions has closed. But we can also sow seeds for green bunching onions like these right here, or you can get scraps from the grocery store and replant them. Since both herbs and onions give off a smell that repels pests, I like to mix it all up by entering them around my veggie crops. Everything is mixed, which confuses the pests and helps to attract pollinators and beneficial insects all around the area instead of in just one spot. The next group of crops is radish, beets, and turnips. If you're in zones 10 and 11, you should have planted all of this stuff by now. You might get away with one more crop of radish if you hurry up and direct sow seeds like right now. It's just getting way too hot for them. Zones 8 and 9 should be fine to direct sow seeds if you wanted to right now. Radishes are great companion plants underneath other bigger veggie crops like tomatoes, or in small spaces like in my green stock garden towers. If you're past your last spring frost date, you can start direct sowing seeds or transplanting all sorts of flowers. If you're not past your last spring frost date, then sow seeds indoors about 6 to 8 weeks before your last spring frost date to get an early start. Just like the herbs, I like to sow rows and rows of flowers in 72 cell seed trays. You could potentially take cuttings and propagate a whole bunch too. Flowers are such an integral part of my garden because they attract loads of pollinators, are host plants for various butterflies and beneficial insects. For the butterflies, I like to plant as much native milkweed as possible, along with other host plants and nectar-rich flowers like these right here. To attract bees and other pollinators, I recommend to sow seeds for sunflowers and tithonia, also agastache, also known as Korean mint, and African blue basil. African blue basil is a hybrid that produces sterile seeds, so it can't be grown from seed. Instead, you need to find a plant or grow some from cuttings. If you can find some, grab a bunch. I also sell African blue basil plants on my website from time to time. It just depends on the season and how quickly I'm able to grow them out. If you're past your last spring frost date, you can start planting flower bulbs. My personal favorites are gladiolus, dahlias, and liatris. Lastly, the worms are coming. Last season was the first time that I direct sow seeds for petite dwarf marigolds under all of my tomatoes. I did it to ward off nematodes, but that really wasn't effective, just saying. However, I have not had a single worm on my tomato plants since September, and it's now March. So that's almost like 6 months of no worm issues. My mind is officially blown because I get hordes of worms right here in my Florida garden. So I am officially a believer that marigolds repel certain pests, but it has to be the French marigolds though. And I chose the petite dwarf variety because they're pretty short plants, like no more than 1 foot tall. So they fit perfectly underneath my tomato plants. If you're past your last spring frost date, then you can start planting tropical root crops like these right here. It is good to plant early so you can take advantage of the long, warm growing season that is to come. If you have not already, or you're not past your last spring frost date yet, then you need to get started with growing out sweet potato slips if you're trying to grow them yourself from a tuber, because that takes months. I just posted a video about a giant sweet potato harvest that I had from growing them in grow bags. I also showed how to propagate and cure sweet potatoes, so very helpful. I will link that video in the description below. If you didn't know, sweet potato leaves make for an awesome edible leafy green, so I would add that to the list of heat tolerant greens as well. Another root crop that is pretty easy to grow once you get the hang of it is carrots. It is too late to just get started with direct sowing seeds for carrots except for zone 8. Everyone else, zones 9 to 11, carrot season starts again in September. Carrots don't grow well in the heat, and if you plant some right now, they would be forming their roots 3 months down the line when it's very hot, and that stunts their growth and makes them taste bitter. Zone 8 has some more weeks of cooler weather, so this is pretty much your last chance to hurry up and direct sow some seeds for carrots. Moving on, the next crop we have are cucumbers and melons. I kind of lump them together because they have very similar growth habits. So this includes anything like the pickling or fresh eating types of cucumbers, or any kind of melon, whether it be a big watermelon, a personal sized one, or cantaloupes, things like that. If you're past your last spring frost date, now is a great time to start direct sowing seeds for all of these crops. In fact, I noticed that they grow much faster when they are direct sown into the ground, right into some soil, instead of when you start them from seed, like in little cups or containers indoors or something like that. Now, if you're not past your last spring frost date, then that's pretty much the only choice you have, and that would be to start them 6 to 8 weeks from seed, like indoors in containers, pots, what have you. And that's fine. That'll help you get an early start on your season because you probably don't have as long as a warm growing season like I do here in Florida. So I got to get to it with direct sowing seeds for a ton of these things. But the number one thing I would say about growing cucumbers, cantaloupe, watermelons is that the worms love to chew them up. I typically find these little green worms with like 2 white stripes on their back. I believe they're called pickle worms, but I think they go by lots of other names. The most effective treatment for that is just regular BT spray. It is crucial that you monitor your little seedlings as soon as they germinate because they can easily chew down a little seedling overnight. I want to show you guys how I build this very easy trellis system, just to give you ideas on how to get into vertical gardening as much as possible, because that will greatly help reduce the amount of pests that get up on your plants and also helps open up your plants to better air circulation, which helps helps prevent a lot of the diseases. I love this system. I've been using this for years. The supplies that you use for this are pretty inexpensive and easy to find no matter where you're located. This thing is very lightweight. I can take it apart and move it into a new part of my garden if I wanted to very easily, which usually is what I do every season. I tend to just change the entire layout of my garden. First, you're gonna need 2 T-posts. The taller the T-posts, the better. The tallest T-posts that I've been able to find are the 10-foot ones, but usually what I find in my local stores close to my house is 6 foot or 7 foot. This one right here is a 6-foot one. And once you drive it into the ground, you're gonna lose some of those inches. That's why I say go with the tallest one you can find. And a lot of times, some of these crops that you would be growing on this vertical trellis have vines that get really long. For example, this is some sweet peas here. They're doing really great. But I know just from experience growing this variety, these vines can get up to 8 to 10 feet tall. Since this is a short trellis, these vines are already going over the top and they really have no more space to grow up. So I'm gonna lose some production here. If I had a taller trellis, then they would continue growing up that length and produce even more for me. I'm aware of this, but I ran out of like the really tall T-post. So I had to use what I had. These are 6-foot ones, but I still get a lot of pea production for my household needs. Next, you're gonna need some metal pipe. This is electrical EMT pipe. I think that's what it's called. This particular piece is 10 foot long. So I installed these T-posts about 10 feet apart. The diameter of this is 3/4 of an inch. I do not recommend you go thinner than that because it will definitely start bending under the weight of whatever you're growing on it. To attach this pipe to the top of my T-post, there's so many ways you can do this. You can wrap string around this just to make it thicker so that it doesn't slide down. You can use a plastic PVC tee like this one right here, or even the L-shaped kind. I simply just push the metal pipe all the way through my PVC tee here and then set it right on the top of my T-post. Then the last thing you need is some heavy duty vinyl mesh trellis. I get this one from Amazon. I know it's a little hard to see with these peas all over it. I've tried so many different brands of vinyl mesh trellis and they tend to fall apart, but this one is really thick. It's actually lasted me several years, which says a lot because I'm in Florida and everything just breaks apart from the elements here. I will definitely put links below in the description if you want to find this same heavy duty mesh vinyl trellis and all of the supplies that I'm using here. I grow all sorts of things on here. I've grown tomatoes on here, heavier crops like loofah or tromboncino rapicante, pole beans, watermelons, Seminole pumpkins. Right now I've got these sweet peas, so very versatile and easy to use. Moving on, it is too late for zone 11, 10, and some of zone 9 gardeners to just get around to sowing seeds for tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. That is my opinion because by the time they start producing, summer will be in full force and it's the summer heat that kills off my tomato plants and terminates my tomato season. Personally, I do not like growing tomatoes over the summer. Pest and disease pressure is just way too high for me here in Florida. In high heat conditions, tomato plants shut down, stop growing, and stop flowering. The same thing happens with my peppers and eggplants too. They essentially just become host plants for all sorts of diseases and pests. I remove all of my tomato plants in June and clean out everything. They can't produce anyways. I do leave my peppers and eggplants because they usually start growing again once temperatures cool down and fall. If you still want to grow some tomatoes, use transplants instead and choose cherry, dwarf, or micro dwarf cultivars because they start producing much earlier than the indeterminates or large beefsteaks. That just ensures you harvest something before summer arrives. And it is totally fine to transplant peppers and eggplants right now. It's just too late to start them from seed. Those of you with last spring frost dates in April can sow seeds for tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants indoors right now so they're ready to be transplanted as soon as they're big enough. I highly recommend using grow lights because this will speed up growth tremendously. It used to take me 12 weeks to get tomatoes to transplant size when using shop lights, but now it takes me 6 weeks when I use official grow lights. They are ready in half the time. I like to use the Mars Hydro 3x3 grow lights and I get these from Amazon. They are a little expensive but work very well and are a huge time saver, especially if you're late to starting seeds. Right now is also a great time for all of us in zones 8 to 11 to plant a new asparagus bed or add new ones to existing beds. And yes, I have successfully grown asparagus right here in my Florida zone 10A garden. I highly recommend that you purchase 2-year-old crowns so they start producing sooner because otherwise it can take a couple years. I have grown all sorts of varieties from Mary Washington, Purple Passion, and some heat tolerant cultivars cultivars like UC 157, they all grow great. I often find bags of crowns at Sam's Club or Tractor Supply, but there are a lot of good online stores that sell them too. I'm actually growing out some UC 157 plants and will offer them on my website very soon. You can also sow seeds for asparagus right now if you want to go that route over buying crowns. They are pretty easy to grow from seed. They just take a while to size up, like 6 months or so that way they're ready to be transplanted. My number one tip when it comes to growing asparagus is that these plants take up a lot of room. Each plant gets 6 feet tall and are very bushy, about 3 to 4 feet wide. Make sure you pick a good permanent spot for them with plenty of room. I planted mine in a really bad spot and I had to dig them all out, which was not fun because asparagus roots are very deep. Up next, we have some tropical heat-loving crops like these right here. I lump all of these plants together because they require warmth to germinate well and grow properly. Right now is a great time for everyone zones 8 to 11 to start them from seed if you have not already. If all danger of frost has passed, you can direct sow seeds if you wish. I just find it easier to sow these indoors on heat mats so I can get better germination. They can be transplanted outside once all danger of frost has passed if you want to try that. I have guides on growing all of these things from seed, which I will link below in the description because it can be a little tricky. Loofah and moringa in particular have pretty hard shells, so you gotta soak them and put them on heat to get them to sprout quickly. My absolute favorite loofah variety is a giant light green colored loofah. It produces really thick loofah sponges, which are great for crafts. I have seeds on my website and very soon some plants. Garden zones 8 to 11, now is a great time to plant fruit trees and plants. Planting now will give trees some time to establish a root system before the extreme heat and rains of summer arrives. If I had to pick just 5 fruiting trees or plants that produce a lot with minimal effort, I would recommend these right here. They don't have too many pest or disease issues and produce a lot once they mature. So I recommend these, especially if you're new to fruit tree. If you are past your last spring frost date, you can plant fruiting trees and plants like these right here. Make sure you do your research and select varieties that will perform well in your area and are cold hardy down to the lowest temperature received in your garden zone if you want to avoid having to cover them up during the winter, because that is not fun. If you're thinking about adding a new tree to your landscape, spring is also a great time to do that. I highly suggest opting for flowering trees to benefit pollinators, such as these right here. As a beekeeper myself, flowering trees are a huge nectar and pollen source for my bees, particularly during dearth periods when there is not much flowering out in nature for the bees to forage on. If you have any suggestions for other flowering trees that support bee populations, please feel free to share in the comments below. All right, everyone, hopefully that gave you a lot of ideas for things you need to start growing right now. Lastly, let's discuss important garden tasks and reminders for the month of March. My first reminder is that spring is here, which means all the pests are starting to wake up from their winter dormancy. Get ready and have treatments in stock at home. For any kind of chewing insect like worms, I use BT spray. For soft-bodied, sucking insects like spider mites and aphids, I like to spray with spinosad or insecticidal soap. And that's it. That's all that I use in my garden. They are all organic and OMRI rated treatments too. I only treat if the situation gets so bad that it actually affects my plants, and I only spray in the evening once the pollinators have left for the day. The only other extremely annoying pests that I deal with are stink bugs and squash bugs. Since they have a hard shell, sprays don't work on them. I do a couple of things. Number one, I plant a lot of sunflowers because the stink bugs really like to gather on them. It just makes it easy for me to collect a bunch of them at the same time. I don't like to touch them, so I wear gloves and either scoop them into a bucket of soapy water so they drown, or vacuum them up with a hand vacuum. Sometimes you will notice clusters of eggs on the underside of the leaves. They are orange and glossy looking. They kind of remind me of Dragon Balls. Just squish them or remove the leaf and drop it into the bucket of soapy water. You might notice they're newly hatched nymphs. They are red and black in color. They don't have a hard shell yet, so spraying with spinosad is effective on them. Some gardeners report to me that making a spray with the very cheap degreaser dish soap from the dollar store is effective because it softens up their hard shells and kills them. I will be trying this and let you guys know if it works. All of these methods are very manual and not fun, just being honest, but if you don't try to control it, one female stink bug can lay hundreds of eggs, so their populations will just explode. As the spring season progresses, the diseases will also start to spread. I highly recommend you get into the habit of cleaning out old, dead, and decaying leaf or plant matter out of the garden. These are hosts for various pathogens and will cause them to spread. Also use mulch as much as possible because this forms a barrier between your plants and the pathogens that are in the soil. Having good garden hygiene helps reduce the need to spray treatments or chemicals. If my plants get powdery mildew or blight, anything really, I spray with 1 cup of hydrogen peroxide per gallon of water. This is the only treatment I use for all sorts of leaf diseases. gardens. Hopefully these tips will help arm you to battle the pests and diseases that are sure to come. March is when things really start to heat up, so I try to hurry up and finish any lingering garden projects, cleaning out and weeding or building new beds. If you need to stock up on garden supplies, seeds, or plants, hurry up and purchase everything as soon as possible. Spring is here and everyone is starting their spring gardens at the same time. Stuff sells out very quickly. And that's it for March, guys. I hope you all like this list I put together and it helps you with your spring and summer gardens. If I missed any seed or plant ideas, feel free to drop a comment below. If you enjoyed this video, a big thumbs up would help me out more than you know. Thanks for watching and happy gardening.